The cemetery on the east side of Seoul was not a place where important men came alone. But Kang Seojun came alone every year. He dismissed his driver at the iron gate, walked the gravel path himself, and stood before the same headstone for exactly 20 minutes. Not 19, not 25, 20. He had done it every year for 11 years, since the morning his mother's heart stopped while he was in a meeting he had chosen not to leave. That was a fact he had never told anyone. The headstone was plain granite. No ornament, no gold lettering. She had hated gold lettering. Just her name, and the 2 dates that bracketed her entire life. Park Sunya, 1962 to 2013. Outside these walls, men flinched when they heard his name. Inside them, he was just a son who had been too late. He arrived at 9:14 a.m., on what would have been her 63rd birthday, carrying a single stem of white chrysanthemum, the flower she had grown in clay pots, on their apartment balcony when he was small. Before the pots got too heavy, and the apartment got too small, and everything he touched turned into something harder than it needed to be. He turned the corner at the 3rd row. He stopped. There were already flowers on her grave. Not dead ones. Not weak old petals browning at the edges. Fresh white chrysanthemums, the same flower he was holding arranged carefully against the granite base, still carrying the faint smell of morning water. Someone had been here recently, perhaps within the hour. Seojun stood without moving for a long moment. His mother had no living family. He had checked that, methodically. In the years after her death, not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. A man in his position needed to know who could be used against him. There was no one. An only child. Parents gone before her. No cousins who acknowledged her. No friends who had survived her circumstances. No one who would know today was her birthday. No one who would know her favorite flower. He crouched down and looked more carefully at the arrangement. Small hands had placed this. The stems were gathered without force, not the way his men handled things, which was to say, with too much grip and too little thought. These had been set down gently, the way someone sets a sleeping child into a bed. He scanned the cemetery. It was nearly empty. An elderly man 2 rows over. A woman in the far corner, moving away, her back to him, dark coat, small frame, walking fast. Too fast. Seojun straightened. His jaw tightened in a way that had, on other occasions, preceded outcomes that could not be undone. He did not run. He did not call out. He simply watched her reach the east gate and disappear through it. And he committed the shape of her to memory, the way he committed everything that mattered to him completely, and without mercy. Someone knew things they should not know, and in his world, that was never an accident. The woman's name, he discovered by noon, was Yoon Hana, 34 years old. No criminal record, no known affiliations. A part-time archivist at the Seoul Municipal Records Office and, 3 evenings a week, a volunteer at a community center in Mapo-gu that served elderly residents with memory disorders. Clean, ordinary, the kind of person his world was not supposed to intersect with. He had her brought to him anyway. Not roughly, he had been specific about that, which was itself unusual enough that his head of security, Cho Min-soo, had paused before relaying the instruction. Bring her in. No pressure. Tell her it's a conversation. Min-soo had not asked why. He had learned, in 7 years of service, that asking why was a different kind of pressure. She arrived at his office at 2:30 p.m. She was not what he expected. He was not sure what he had expected: fear, calculation, the practiced composure of someone who had been briefed on what to say. He got none of those things. She walked in carrying a canvas tote bag against her chest like a shield she didn't fully believe in, and when she saw him behind the desk, she stopped walking but did not look away. That was the first thing he noticed. She didn't look away. Most people did. Sit down, he said. She sat, placed the tote bag on her lap, folded her hands over it. Seojun studied her for a moment the way he studied everything, looking for the gap between what something appeared to be and what it actually was. You were at Yongma Cemetery this morning, he said. Section C, row 3, my mother's grave. Something moved across her face. Not guilt, closer to grief. Yes, she said. How did you know it was her birthday? She was quiet for 3 seconds, not the silence of someone constructing a lie, but the silence of someone deciding how much truth was safe to carry into a room like this. I work in the Municipal Records Archive, she said finally. Birth records, death records, family registrations. I've been there 4 years. She paused. I came across your mother's file just over a year ago. There was a notation in the margin handwritten. It said she had requested her date of birth be added to her burial registration. Specifically, she had written the request herself. Seojun said nothing. Most people don't do that, Hana continued, her voice quieter now. The date of death gets recorded. The birthday disappears. She didn't want that. A beat. I thought she must have been someone who believed birthdays mattered. Even after. He looked at her for a long moment. You visited her grave, he said. Not once. I checked with the groundskeeper this morning. You have been there 4 times in the past 14 months. Every significant date. Hana's hands tightened slightly over the tote bag. Yes, she said. I'm sorry. I know it wasn't my place. I know she wasn't. I didn't know her. She stopped. Started again more carefully. I just didn't want her to be alone on her birthday. On those days. Something shifted in the room that Seojun could not immediately name. He had carried 11 years of a single private guilt, that his mother had died before he could correct the specific error of that morning, the meeting he had not left, the call he had let ring out. He had never said it aloud. He had built an entire architecture of coldness around it, and it had served him well, and no one had ever walked into his office and said anything that made that architecture feel, for one moment, like the wrong response to a wound. He set down the pen he had been holding. You said you didn't know her, he said. But you brought her chrysanthemums, her specific flower. It isn't listed in any record. For the first time, Hana looked uncertain. She reached into the tote bag and withdrew a small, aged notebook, its cover soft from handling, its pages dense with handwriting. She placed it on the edge of his desk carefully, the way she had placed the flowers, with 2 hands, without force. This was in the file, she said. Tucked inside the registration envelope. I don't think anyone had opened it in years. I don't know how it got there. She looked at him steadily. I think it was hers. Seojun did not move. I haven't read past the first page, Hana said. I want you to know that. The first page mentioned the flowers. I stopped there. It wasn't mine to read. The room was very quiet. Seojun looked at the notebook on the edge of his desk, his mother's handwriting. 11 years of silence. A stranger who had visited a grave 4 times because she believed birthdays mattered even after death. He had intended this conversation to be an interrogation. He was no longer sure what it was. If this story is already under your skin, good. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. Because this isn't just about a man finding flowers on his mother's grave. It's about what happens when the one thing you buried most carefully refuses to stay buried. He did not open the notebook that day. He placed it in the drawer to the left of his desk, the one with the lock, where he kept the things that required more composure than he currently had, and he dismissed Hana with the same careful instruction he had used to bring her in. A car will take you home. Don't mention this meeting. She had nodded, picked up her tote bag, and walked out without asking what came next. He noticed that too. Most people asked what came next. He spent the remainder of the afternoon in back-to-back meetings that required his full attention, and received perhaps 60% of it. By evening he was aware that something had shifted in his internal architecture, in a way he could not yet locate or name, which was a condition he did not tolerate well and had not experienced in a very long time. At 11 p.m., he unlocked the drawer. The notebook was exactly 61 pages. He knew because he counted before he read a habit, the same way he assessed a room's exits before he sat down in it. His mother's handwriting was small and precise, the penmanship of a woman who had been taught that neatness was a form of respect. She had written in it irregularly, sometimes daily, sometimes with gaps of months. The earliest entry was dated March 2009, 4 years before she died. He read it in one sitting. By the 3rd entry, he understood why she had requested her birthday be added to the burial record. I don't need much. I only need someone to remember that I was here. Not what I survived. Just that I existed, and that I loved things, the flowers on the balcony, the smell of rain before it arrives, the way Seojun used to fall asleep at the table when he was small and pretend he hadn't. Just that. He set the notebook down, picked it up again. By the 44th page, he found the entry that stopped him completely. It was dated 8 months before her death. She had written it in a different pen, darker, slower, as though she had chosen her words with unusual care. There is a woman who works at the records office. I went in last week to update my filing. She was kind to me in a way that felt accidental, the way real kindness usually does. She helped me add the birthday notation. She didn't ask why. I think she understood without needing it explained. I have left the notebook in the file, for her to find. I don't know if she will. I don't know if it matters. I only know I felt, walking out of that building, that someone would remember. Seojun read the entry 3 times. The notebook had not found its way into that envelope by accident. His mother had placed it there deliberately for a woman at the records office, who had been kind to her without needing to explain why. A woman who would have been, at that time, approximately 22 years old, and who would likely have no memory of a single quiet interaction years later. His mother had always been, in his assessment, the better judge of character between the two of them. He picked up his phone and called Min-soo. "The archivist," he said. "Yoon Hana. I need her full history, not just the standard profile. Everything. Where she grew up, who her family is, why she's working a government archive job at 34 with..." He checked the file still open on his desk. A postgraduate degree in historical preservation. Min-soo was quiet for a moment. "That level of pull takes until morning. Then have it for me at morning." He hung up and looked again at the notebook entry. His mother had chosen this woman, had seen something in a brief administrative interaction, a quality of kindness that felt accidental, which his mother had apparently understood to be the only kind worth trusting. She had left her most private record with a stranger, based on that single quality. The report arrived at 6:47 a.m. He read it standing at his window with his coffee going cold. Yoon Hana. Born in Incheon, raised by her grandmother after both parents died in a road accident when she was 9 years old. Grandmother Yoon Bokja had passed just over a year ago, which aligned precisely with when Hana had first visited his mother's grave. Postgraduate thesis: The Ethics of Memory Preservation in Municipal Death Records, Who Decides What Gets Kept. He set the report down slowly. She had lost her grandmother. She had a thesis dedicated to the question of who deserved to be remembered. She had found his mother's file, read a handwritten request, and decided without instruction or incentive that this woman's birthday mattered. That was not research. That was not coincidence. That was grief. Recognizing grief across an archival envelope. He spent the rest of that day verifying the surveillance intelligence before he moved on it. He needed to be certain. The following morning, Min-soo called. "You need to see something," Min-soo said. His voice had a particular flatness that Seojun had learned to treat as an early warning system. "The leaf action. They've been watching the cemetery." Seojun went very still. "How long?" "Our sweep found equipment consistent with 3 to 4 weeks of surveillance. Whoever placed it wasn't watching your mother's grave." A pause. "They were watching to see who you'd follow out of it." The silence that followed was the kind Seojun used when he was deciding whether a situation required patience or something faster than patience. They had watched him follow Hana, and if the equipment had been in place for 3 to 4 weeks, long enough to have captured her prior visits, they may have already known exactly who she was before he did, which meant she had been in danger longer than he had realized. He pulled Hana into protective custody on the second morning. Not her apartment, they would expect that. He had her moved to a secondary property in Yongsan, a quiet building his organization used for nothing that could be traced back to anything, and he sent 2 of his most trusted men to sit outside her door with instructions that were, by his usual standards, remarkably simple. Nothing happens to her. She was not pleased about this. When he arrived at the Yongsan property at 9 a.m., she was sitting at the kitchen table with her arms folded and the specific expression of someone who had spent the preceding hour deciding exactly what they intended to say. "You can't just move people," she said. "I can," he said. "I did. I have work. There are records I'm responsible for. A Tuesday volunteer shift that both have been handled." She stared at him. "You called my supervisor?" "My assistant called your supervisor. There's a difference." He sat down across from her. "There are people watching you because of me. Until I understand the full scope of that, you will stay here." The argument went out of her face, replaced by something more complicated. "Because of the cemetery," she said. "Because of the cemetery." She was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "Are you going to tell me why someone would use your mother's grave to surveil you?" "I'm going to tell you what I know," he said. "Which is not yet everything." He told her about the leaf action, not the full architecture of it, but enough. A rival organization that had been systematically dismantling his operations for 14 months through a method he had not been able to fully identify. Not direct confrontation. Something more patient than that. They were building something. A case. A leverage position. A pressure point. And they had been doing it quietly enough that he had only seen the edges of it. "They followed you from the cemetery to me," Hana said. It wasn't a question. Yes, and they may have identified you before that from your prior visits. She absorbed this with a steadiness he was still adjusting to. Most people, when informed they had become collateral in a criminal organization's strategic maneuvering, did not look steady. They looked like the situation required more reaction than they were capable of producing. Hana looked like she was solving a problem. "Then I need to show you something," she said. She reached for the tote bag, which she had apparently refused to leave at her apartment, which meant his men had transported it alongside her, and withdrew a manila folder. She placed it on the table between them. "I didn't bring only the notebook that day," she said. "There was a second document in the registration envelope. I didn't mention it in your office because I needed to understand it first. I've spent the past 2 days working through it." Seojun opened the folder. Inside was a single page, a formal document, municipal letterhead, dated 12 years ago, 3 weeks before his mother's death. It was an amendment to her death registration, pre-filed. The cause of death had been entered in advance as cardiac failure accurate, as it turned out, but the document had been submitted and processed before she died. Someone had known. Seojun read the document twice. The room was very quiet. "The filing clerk's signature," Hana said carefully. "I ran it against the employee records from that period. That clerk resigned the week after your mother died. No forwarding information. No record of employment anywhere in the municipal system after that date." She paused. "But I found a secondary record. A payroll amendment from the same week, processed by a supervising administrator." She reached into the folder and placed a second page beside the first. "The supervising administrator's name." Seojun looked at the name. He did not move for a long time. The name on the page was Kang Dohan, his uncle, his father's younger brother, the man who had stood at her funeral in the front row and wept with a convincingness that Seojun had never once questioned because grief, he had believed, was the one thing people did not perform in front of him. His mother had not died of a heart condition that arrived without warning. Someone had known the date, had filed the paperwork in advance, had ensured the cause of death would be recorded without investigation, and the person who had authorized that bureaucratic erasure was the man who had spent 11 years sitting across from Seojun at every family dinner, every strategy meeting, every anniversary of her death, with tears that Seojun now understood had been the most precise performance of his career. The Lee faction's 14 months of patient maneuvering, the surveillance at the cemetery, his uncle, who held a senior advisory position in his organization and had access to every operational detail Seojun had never thought to protect from family. The edges he had only been able to see suddenly had a shape. He closed the folder. When he looked up, Hana was watching him with the careful attention of someone who understood they were witnessing something that had no appropriate response. She did not offer one. She simply stayed present in the silence, the way he realized she had stayed present at a grave that wasn't hers to visit, because she understood that some things required witness rather than words. "Your mother knew," Hana said quietly. "I think that's why she left the notebook. She couldn't prove it, but she knew something was wrong with the filing. She worked in a municipal office herself for 3 years. In the 1990s, it's in her records. She would have recognized a pre-filed amendment." "Why didn't she report it?" he asked. It was the question he needed answered not for the case, but for himself. Hana was quiet for a moment. A municipal complaint filed under her own name would have passed through the same administrative chain Dohan sat inside. It would have reached him before it reached anyone who could act on it. She knew that. A pause. "And she knew what you would have done if she'd come to you directly, before you were ready." His mother had left a trail. Not to the police, she would have known what that meant for him. Not to him directly, she would have known what that would have required him to do before he was ready. She had left it to a woman who was kind without needing to explain why. And she had left it in the one place she trusted her son to eventually follow. Her grave, on her birthday. She had known he would come. She had known, if the right person found it first, that the truth would find its way to him, when he was finally able to carry it. 11 years late, right on time. Hana was looking at him carefully. "She left it for me to find," she said. Not a question, a realization arriving in real time. "She didn't misfile it. She put it there for me. Someone she met once." "Yes," he said. Hana was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, lower, more deliberate. "Then every time I went to that grave," she said slowly, "I wasn't just visiting a stranger. I was doing what she asked." Seojun said nothing. There was nothing to add. His mother had chosen this woman in a single interaction. based on a quality of kindness that had apparently been sufficient. And she had been right. She had always been right. Seojun spent 3 days building the case the way he built everything, without margin for error. He did not confront his uncle immediately. He did not call a meeting, did not alter his behavior, did not allow a single visible degree of change in how he spoke to Do-han across a strategy table on Monday morning, while internally cataloging every access point his uncle had exploited across 14 months. He smiled at the appropriate moments. He deferred to Do-han's counsel on 2 minor operational decisions. He performed normalcy with the same precision his uncle had performed grief for 11 years. It was the most controlled he had ever felt, and the most dangerous. Hana remained in Yongsan. He visited each evening not because protocol required it, but because he had stopped pretending, at least to himself, that his reasons were entirely professional. They would sit at the kitchen table with the folder between them, and she would walk him through each document with the methodical care of someone who had spent 4 years learning that paper held truth longer than people did. She had cross-referenced the pre-filed amendment against 3 separate municipal databases. She had found 2 additional altered records, both related to property transfers made in the month after his mother's death, both benefiting Do-han. He moved fast, she said on the 2nd evening. He had the paperwork ready before she was gone. This wasn't opportunistic. She looked at Seojun carefully. He planned it while she was still alive. Seojun said nothing. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't already contain. On the 3rd evening, she asked him how he intended to use it. "There's an annual foundation dinner," he said. "Friday. The Kang Family Foundation. My mother established it in 2008. Do-han has chaired it since her death." He paused. 400 guests. Municipal officials, business leaders, 2 senior prosecutors, who have been trying to build a case against my organization for 6 years. He looked at her. "They will be there Friday." Hana was quiet for a moment. "You're going to give them something better than what they came for," she said. "I'm going to give them everything they need to do their jobs correctly." The foundation dinner was held in a ballroom in Junggu, the kind of venue his mother would have found excessive and attended anyway because she had understood that presence was sometimes its own form of argument. Do-han stood at the entrance greeting guests with the particular warmth of a man who had never once believed the ground beneath him could move. Seojun arrived late. Hana was not with him, he had been explicit about that. She was with Minsu, 2 buildings away, and she had argued about it until he told her that the one thing he could not do tonight was divide his attention, and she had recognized that for what it was and stopped arguing. He took his seat at the head table. He waited until Do-han finished his opening remarks, a 4-minute tribute to his mother's legacy, delivered with the practiced sorrow of a man who had rehearsed it so many times. It had achieved a kind of terrible fluency, and then he stood. The room expected a toast. He gave them the screens instead. Minsu had prepared the presentation with the same architecture Seojun used for everything that mattered: systematic, irrefutable, sequenced for maximum comprehension. The pre-filed death amendment appeared first, large enough to read from the back of the room. The clerk's signature, the authorization, the name. The room went very still. The property transfer records came second, then the payroll amendment. Then a 3rd document Hana had located on the final morning, a communication between Do-han and a senior figure in the Lee faction, dated 14 years ago, 2 years before his mother's death, long enough to establish that this had never been about opportunity. Do-han stood from his chair. "This is fabricated," he said. His voice carried the automatic authority of a man who had never needed to defend himself before. "This is... The originals are already with the prosecutors," Seojun said. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to raise his voice. "Both of them, who are sitting at table 7. The room turned. Table 7 turned. Do-han turned last. One of the prosecutors was already on his phone. What happened next was architectural. The way collapse always is not a single dramatic moment, but a sequence of smaller ones arriving too fast to stop. 2 of Do-han's longest-standing allies stood and walked to opposite sides of the room. A municipal official, Seojun, recognized from the property records, quietly placed his napkin on his plate and did not pick it up again. A photographer near the back, who had been hired to document the evening's philanthropic proceedings, continued taking photographs for entirely different reasons. Do-han looked across the ballroom at his nephew. Seojun looked back. 11 years of performed grief. 11 years of access. 11 years of sitting across tables from a man who had decided his mother's life was an obstacle to be administratively resolved. She knew. Seojun said, quietly enough that only Do-han could hear it. She left me everything I needed. She just knew I had to be ready to use it. The prosecutors reached Table 7's exit at the same moment the doors opened. The cameras kept recording. Kang Do-han's hands, Seojun noticed, were not steady. Do-han was formally charged on a Saturday morning. Seojun did not watch the arrest. He had seen enough of what justice looked like in motion. The handcuffs, the cameras, the particular smallness that power assumes when the structure supporting it is removed. He had built the case, delivered the evidence, and stepped back. What happened next belonged to systems that did not require him. He spent that Saturday at the cemetery instead. He arrived at 9:14 a.m., the same time as always. He was carrying 2 stems of white chrysanthemum. He noticed, as he turned onto the gravel path, that he had taken them from the same vendor without thinking one for the usual visit, and one that he understood, without needing to examine it, was for something that had changed. He crouched at the headstone and stayed longer than 20 minutes. He did not count. For the first time in 11 years, he did not count. He told her what had happened. He was not a man who spoke to gravestones as a rule, but he had decided that rules established to manage grief were permitted to be retired once the grief had been properly addressed. He told her about the notebook, about the pre-filed amendment, about the woman she had trusted with her most careful act of foresight. He told her she had been right about all of it. The investigation took 4 months. Do-han's cooperation offered in exchange for considerations that were ultimately less generous than his lawyers had anticipated, filled in the architecture that the documents had only outlined. The Lee faction connection ran deeper than a single alliance. 3 additional figures within Seojun's organization were implicated. Each was removed with the systematic efficiency of a man who had learned, across a very painful autumn, that loyalty was not inherited through proximity. Seojun restructured. It was slow work, the kind that did not make for dramatic observation. New protocols, new compartmentalization, a sustained contraction of the organization's scope that his lieutenants accepted without full understanding, and his rivals interpreted, incorrectly, as weakness. He let them interpret it incorrectly. He had learned patience from a woman who had spent 4 years placing documents in the right order and trusting that the right person would eventually find them. Hana returned to her apartment in November. He had ensured the building's security was comprehensively upgraded before she moved back, which she discovered when she tried to enter the lobby and found a new keycard system, a reinforced door, and a quietly professional woman in the ground floor unit who was not, as Hana correctly assessed within 48 hours, actually a graduate student. She called him about it. "The graduate student," she said. "I don't know what you're referring to." "Seoyun." He was quiet for a moment. "Her name is Jeon. She's very good. You won't notice her." "I noticed her immediately. You have an unusual skill set." There was a pause on the line that had the quality of a smile being suppressed. "Thank you," she said, quietly. The way she said most things that mattered without performance, without inflation, as though the words were sufficient and did not need decoration. He visited in December, then January, then with an increasing frequency that neither of them formally acknowledged until the evening in February when he arrived at her apartment and she had already made tea for 2 without being asked, and they both understood that something had long since been decided without requiring a conversation. It was not dramatic. It was not the thing he would have predicted for himself, this particular domestic simplicity. This woman across a kitchen table who spoke to him without adjustment, who had visited his mother's grave 4 times because she believed birthdays deserved witness, who had carried a folder of documents into the most dangerous room she had ever entered and placed them on a table with 2 hands and without force. He had spent his life in a world that ran on leverage and velocity. She operated entirely on patience and precision. He had found, over the preceding months, that patience and precision were more durable than anything his world had taught him to value. In March, 6 months after the foundation dinner, the Kang Family Foundation was formally reconstituted. New board, new charter. Its primary initiative, proposed by Seojun, structured by Hana, named without discussion, was a preservation program for municipal records in underserved districts, ensuring that birth dates, death dates, and the handwritten notations of ordinary people were maintained with the same care as those of important ones. His mother's name was on the charter. Her birthday was listed alongside her date of death. Both dates, permanent, irrefutable, exactly as she had requested. On what would have been her 64th birthday, Seojun arrived at the cemetery at 9:14 a.m. Hana was already there. She had brought chrysanthemums. 2 stems, same as him. She looked up when she heard the gravel under his feet, and did not seem surprised, the way she rarely seemed surprised by anything he did anymore, which he had come to understand was the specific form her trust took. Not the absence of expectation, but the presence of something steadier than expectation. He crouched beside her at the headstone. They stayed longer than 20 minutes. Neither of them counted. There is something I need to tell you before we close this story. Seojun never intended to find anything at that grave except silence. That was what he had trained himself to accept across 11 years, that grief was a thing you managed through discipline, that love was a thing you protected by never letting anyone close enough to use it against you, and that the dead stayed where you put them, and did not leave you anything new to carry. He was wrong about all of it. His mother had understood something about her son that he had not yet understood about himself, that the coldness was not his nature, it was his response. There is a difference, a significant one, between who a person becomes under pressure and who they actually are when the pressure is finally, carefully, removed. She had spent the last years of her life arranging for the pressure to be removed, not through confrontation, not through dramatic intervention, through a notebook placed in a file envelope, in the hands of a woman who was kind without needing to explain why, left in a building where records were kept and birthdays were, if someone cared enough, preserved. She had bet everything on patience, on the right person, on her son eventually being ready. She had won. I want to talk about Hana for a moment, because I think she is the part of this story that deserves the most attention and gets overlooked the fastest. Hana did not rescue Seojun. She did not soften him, or fix him, or walk into his darkness and illuminate it through the power of her goodness, which is the version of this story that would be easier to tell and significantly less true. What she did was more specific and more difficult than that. She saw a handwritten request from a woman who did not want her birthday forgotten. She decided, without incentive, without instruction, without any reason that would satisfy someone who needed reasons to be practical, that this mattered. She acted on that decision 4 times across 14 months, in a cemetery, alone, for a woman she had never met. And then, when the consequences of that decision walked into the most dangerous office she had ever entered, she did not run. She placed a folder on a table with 2 hands. She told the truth about what she had found and what she had not read, because the line between those 2 things mattered to her even when no one was checking. That is not a small thing. In a story full of power and leverage and the architecture of organized crime, the most structurally load-bearing element is a 34-year-old archivist who believed that ordinary people deserved to be remembered. She was right. Here is what this story is actually about. Underneath everything else, it is about what happens when someone decides that the overlooked thing, the handwritten notation, the unfamous grave, the birthday that disappears from the record, is worth preserving. It is about the fact that truth, properly filed, outlasts the people who need it buried. It is about mothers who love their children in the most patient and precise ways available to them, and children who are not ready to receive that love until they have done enough living to understand what it cost. And it is about the specific kind of courage it takes to walk into a room where you have no power and place the evidence on the table anyway, because the alternative is allowing something true to remain hidden, and you have decided quietly, without announcement, that you are not the kind of person who permits that. You stayed until the end of this story. That tells me something about you. You are the kind of person who believes that the overlooked things matter, that ordinary people deserve the same quality of memory as important ones, that grief is not weakness, and patience is not passivity and kindness. The accidental, unperformed kind is the most structurally sound thing a person can offer another human being. You are my people. Subscribe and join this community because every story we tell here is built on that same foundation. The person who was dismissed. The truth that survived. The love that was patient enough to outlast everything that tried to bury it. Leave me a comment with this. Who is the person in your life who remembered something about you that you thought everyone had forgotten? Drop their name, or just a heart, and let them exist in this space for a moment. And if this story moved you, if it hit somewhere specific and true, share it. You know someone who needs to hear that the things they carefully preserved will eventually find their way to exactly the right person. They always do. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.